As the Quranic text in the Islamic tradition has asserted, that we have created you as tribes and nations so that you can get to know one another. Indeed, the most honorable amongst you is the one who is the most God fearing. Of course, those of you who may be more secular minded can understand God fearing in this context in a more practical sense to also mean pious or kind hearted, or just perhaps in general a moral man, somebody who is virtuous, just generally. I'm sure people have different conceptions, whether they're maybe on the more secular side or on the more religious side or on the more spiritual side, about what perhaps a moral or virtuous man may be. Yet, in general, there's an important theme being expressed here in this verse of the Quran. And that is that piety is not to be restricted, or let's say virtue, right? Virtue or morality is not to be restricted to a geographical location. It's not necessarily to be only found within a certain tradition or a certain culture or just one group of people. It's not necessarily the case that amongst human beings, amongst people in general, amongst humanity within its broader history, there has only been one group that has been on the right path, let's say, or who has found the complete truth. But rather, there are reflections of truth, reflections of virtue, reflections of goodness, so to speak, within all peoples. And all peoples are, at the end of the day, they're human beings. And as a result, not only do they have inherent rights, inherent responsibilities, let's say, they have an inherent sense of humanity, but the cultures that have developed from them, the ideas that have developed from them, have fundamentally to be based within the broader human experience and human condition in general, which means we have to humanize them. But not only do we have to humanize them, we have to get out of our own arrogance and our own ego to think that our own group is the correct one or that our own ideas are the correct one, and to acknowledge the fact that the truth or virtue can be found amongst other groups, and that we shouldn't necessarily restrict ourselves to one group. But you see, this is the issue that exclusionary politics often falls into. Exclusionary politics essentially glorifies ignorance of the other, and it presents purposeful caricatures of the other. It presents the other as backwards, incorrect, whatever you want to call it, deviant, like honestly, whatever derogative terms you can use. And that our group has it correct. Our group is not perfect, right? But it's the best we have. And so we should stick to it and we shouldn't delve outside of our traditions, our ideas, our systems, and interact with other people. The fundamental issue with exclusionary politics, then, is that by nature of its exclusionary nature, it remains purposefully ignorant of other traditions, other cultures, at the expense of its own learning, at the expense of its own becoming more knowledgeable, and at the expense of it being so arrogant so as to just dismiss all other parts of the human experience in the forms of other people, other nations, other cultures, other tribes, and just to consider its own group as the best they have, and therefore other groups are not worthy of even being interacted with, or at the very least not being intermingled with or taken seriously as part of their own nation. Yet this is quite clearly not the case. Humanity is a broad group of people. The broader human condition and experience has been reflected in countless cultures, countless tribes, countless nations, countless empires, countless religions, countless philosophies. So to stay willingly ignorant of all of these things and just to persist in your own group, to me at least, just seems very unwise, very naive, and a very foolish way to understand humanity. This is why, for example, we so intuitively understand what Jesus of Nazareth said, for example, in the New Testament, that love your enemies and pray for them so that you may attain your Father's kingdom in heaven. Or, for example, that treat others, the golden rule, right, in the Bible, that treat others the way that you want to be treated. Or, for example, just the countless other sort of judgments or attitudes expressed by Jesus of Nazareth, where he's quite clearly emphasizing people, he's quite clearly telling people that they should interact with one another in a loving, kind, caring manner. And the very basic truth here is that we're all human beings. We're all people with certain inherent value, and we are all worth of being appreciated. But exclusionary politics may inevitably and implicitly, at least, even if they don't overtly or openly acknowledge or say this out loud, will inevitably lead to an attitude where, at the very best, you're going to leave out other people because, to be honest, you couldn't really care less about them, or that you just want to stay within your own group, which again is just a kind of willful ignorance. And at the very worst, it creates a very strongly exclusionary, perhaps even supremacist attitude towards other groups. And it just, once again, it supports this kind of ignorant attitude, purposeful ignorance of other groups. Of course, the question, of nationalism does come up here, about nationalism being an exclusionary ideology. I have discussed before, obviously, that nationalism initially began as a left-wing ideology. And to be fair, nationalism can oftentimes be a unifying force amongst broader groups of people. You can see this, for example, in anti-colonial movements in the Third World, right, where certain groups of people come together to assert their nations, their people's self-determination. And in that context, obviously, nationalism can be a unifying force amongst broader groups of people and broader classes of society. The same can be said, for example, initially within the European Western context, where nationalism was very much a progressive force. But over time, of course, nationalism has become a right-wing force, so to say. In and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the issue inherent in nationalism, of course, which I think right-wingers do have to acknowledge, and the right do have to understand this point. And I'm not saying that every single person who is on the right, or every single person within a nationalist party, or who has certain nationalist sentiments and tendencies, let's say, is a bad person. That's not all what I'm saying. But they do have to acknowledge this fundamental problem, right? I'm not accusing them of anything. I'm just pointing out this inherent issue within nationalism. By its nature, it is very exclusionary. It fundamentally does create an us and them, the us and the other kind of narrative, that the in-group is the basis on which we should sort of organize our society around, organize our nation around. And it fundamentally leaves out a lot of other groups. It fundamentally puts those groups kind of to the side. And this becomes an issue when you just consider it very practically, the consequences of such a nationalist attitude. It really just leads in a way to this implicit prioritization of one's own culture, one's own traditions over another. And this, obviously by nature, is quite exclusionary, but it does lead to a very prejudiced and discriminatory attitude towards other groups. And this fundamentally becomes very problematic when you have to deal with different groups in your everyday life in a social context and in a broader global context. Because at the end of the day, human beings have interacted with each other since time immemorial. And nations, by their very nature, are constantly changing. Nations aren't solid, non-changing entities. They are constantly changing, they are constantly evolving, they are in a sense very fluid. So it becomes very difficult to define what a nation exactly is, but inevitably the logical consequence of that is you will end up in a cycle or in a condition where you're going to have to introduce more exclusionary and even more exclusionary standards of what constitutes your nation's in-group. And these more and more and more exclusionary standards will leave out more and more and more people. And you end up with the result of a very kind of somber, let's say, social attitude where there's a lot of prejudice and a lot of discrimination against certain groups of people because they're not part of your in-group.